The Australia-Malta Assisted Passage Agreement was signed 75 years ago on the 31st of May 1948 by Australia's Immigration Minister Arthur Calwell and the Commissioner for Malta, Captain Henry Kurmi, who was Malta's representative in Australia. The assistance scheme had received in-principle agreement as early as 1944, but the Australian government was reluctant to take it any further without a guarantee of additional shipping for Maltese migrants. That guarantee had to come from the United Kingdom government. The UK government was keen to give shipping priority to its own prospective emigrants, and Australia was undoubtedly keen to receive UK immigrants as a priority. The signing of the agreement was made possible when it became clear that shipping would be available, due in part to the gradual post-war conversion of troopships. The agreement for assisted passages can also be seen as a major step in the long-standing struggle by the Maltese and their friends in Australia to be classified as, quote, white British subjects in immigration policy, rather than as, quote, semi-white and subject to restrictive quotas, which had been the case since 1920. It's hard to believe now that in 1934 a senior immigration officer could state in a memo to the Minister of Interior that, quote, although the Maltese are British subjects, they are of an alien kind as so far as race is concerned, end quote. In the 30 years after World War II, more than 140,000 Maltese emigrated to various parts of the world. Most of them came to Australia. About 1 in 5 went to Britain, about 1 in 10 to Canada, and less went to America. This was an extraordinary migration movement, given that Malta's population over the same period was about 320,000. The number of Malta-born people in Australia increased from 3,238 in 1947 to more than 55,000 20 years later. In other words, approximately 1 in every 5 Maltese in Malta migrated to Australia during that period. Australia needed labour after the war to fuel industrial expansion, and the Immigration Minister, Arthur Calwell, expressed the Labor government's policy concisely when he said Australia had to populate or perish. Australia's capacity for defence, economic development and population growth were all seen as interconnected and were the basis of the government's commitment to assisted migration on a mass scale. Australia's population in 1947 was 7.6 million, and Calwell's aim was to attract 70,000 people a year from Britain and Europe. The migration process is characterised by push and pull factors, and the Australia-Malta Assisted Passage Agreement provided an incentive for Maltese migration, as it provided for permanent settlement. Permanent settlement was defined as a minimum of 2 years under the agreement. Prospective emigrants could be nominated by friends or relatives in Australia for assisted passage, provided the nominator could guarantee accommodation. The agreement also provided for group nominations to be made by government instrumentalities and other organisations, mostly for those who were in occupational categories in demand. There was also a child migration scheme and a single young women migrant scheme. In 1949 and the 1950s, Maltese tradesmen were recruited in groups to build the national capital in Canberra. Others worked at Woomera. The State Electricity Commission of Victoria needed workers at the Lawn Brown coal mine, and the South Australian Water Board and the West Australian Railways needed labourers, while the Queensland Government recruited groups of sugarcane cutters. And there were also occasional group nominations by private companies, for example the Metropolitan Ice and Fresh Food Company in Melbourne. Most Maltese, however, were assisted by personal rather than group nomination, and no applicant for an assisted passage could be successful unless there was a reasonable assurance that they could obtain employment and accommodation. The agreement stipulated that reception and welfare was the responsibility of the Commissioner for Malta in Australia, but the Commonwealth Employment Service offered to help obtain work. Also, from the date of arrival, Maltese migrants would be eligible for health and medical service benefits, maternity allowances, child endowment and sickness and unemployment benefits. The extent of assistance towards the passages to Australia was set out in the agreement schedule. It stipulated that costs were to be shared by the two governments. All migrants aged 19 and over would be charged no less than 10 English pounds. Juveniles aged 14 up to the age of 19, no less than £5, and children under 14 travelled for free. The schedule listed the sums to be contributed by the Australian government and specified that the Maltese government had to make a contribution that was not less than that of Australia. The Australian government paid £30 sterling for each approved migrant aged over 19. Each applicant had to supply certificates of good character and, where applicable, evidence of trade qualifications. The next step in the procedure involved a medical examination by a Maltese government doctor and then approved by the Australian government. In Australia there was a demand for labour which was well publicised in Malta. Wages were relatively high and Australia was far from the war-torn devastation of Europe. There were opportunities for the future, and many of the migrants that I have interviewed over the decades mention that they migrated primarily for the benefit of their children. Australia siphoned off much of the cream of the Maltese population, especially its skilled tradesmen. In September 1948, there were more than 20,000 prospective emigrants registered for Australia in Malta, and about a quarter were skilled tradesmen. Until the 1970s, the migrants travelled mostly by ship, and these migrant boats ranged from converted warships to comfortable passenger liners, with the occasional notorious hell ship. The scarcity of shipping after the war meant that emigrants had to take whatever was available. The first group of post-war emigrants left Malta on the Rangatiki on the 10th of January 1946. There were 64 Maltese in all, and they were either returning migrants or related to Maltese already settled in Australia. The Times of Malta described the scene at the Valletta Customs House in the following way. It was a mixture of sadness and gaiety. There were tears and smiles and handkerchief waving as the ship slowly left the harbour. This scene would be repeated many times, but with much larger numbers of Maltese migrant passengers. The conflicting emotions would have applied to each and every voyage. In August 1948, the largest group to ever migrate to Australia on one ship, up to that time, arrived on the Strathnaver. There were 451 Maltese, along with 900 Polish ex-servicemen. Now, the Australia-Malta Assisted Passage Agreement was not meant to be officially implemented until the 1st of January 1949, but as it had been signed in May 1948, the Strathnaver Maltese were permitted to be covered by it. Such was the desperation for shipping after the war that the Strathnaver was still in troop-carrying condition when it brought its passengers to Australia. In 1948 and 1949, migrants from Malta arrived in Australia on ships such as the Moreton Bay, Pardizanca, Esperance Bay, Orduna, Toscana, Asturias, Largs Bay, Sirenia, Suriento, Columbia, and one of the notorious hell ships was the Msir. In late 1949, the Columbia brought more than 1,000 Maltese to Australia, and this was the first occasion when such numbers had arrived from Malta on a single voyage. I'll mention some of the other ships that brought more than 1,000 Maltese on a single voyage. They're special to the story, and 1,000 passengers on one ship is a lot of people. In addition to the Columbia in 1949, the following brought more than 1,000 Maltese to Australia on a single trip: the Ocean Victory, the Ocean Triumph, the Florentia, the Castel Felice, and the Scorbrin. Of all the migrant ships, my special favourite is the Asturias. It brought 4,500 Maltese to Australia on 14 different voyages between 1949 and 1952. And there's an excellent website dedicated to the Asturias. The Asturias began as an armed merchant ship in 1925. She was torpedoed in 1943, but then refitted as a migrant carrier in 1948. She became a troop ship in 1954 and was scrapped in 1957. In her short life as a migrant ship, she brought a total of 30,000 people to Australia, mostly from the United Kingdom. The push factors in Malta were overwhelming. Malta was the most densely populated place in the British Empire, with more than 2,000 people to the square mile and an increasing birth rate. The cost of living had risen eightfold over the pre-war level, but wages had only doubled. Malta's Department of Emigration and Labour reported that on an average of 3 dependents to each worker, it will be found that in 10 years' time we shall, except for a bigger and vigorously sustained emigration drive, have a population of 120,000 unprovided for, with terrible consequences to the standard of living, the life and the economy of the island. In 1949, 42,000 Maltese were registered for emigration. Much of the credit for the favourable circumstances for emigration after the war goes to John J. Cole, who was Malta's first emigration minister after self-government was attained in 1947. He travelled extensively on a hectic trip to London, Canada, the US and Australia between September and December 1948 to lobby for Malta's prospective emigrants. He travelled with his Director of Emigration, John Axisa, and he met with Prime Minister Ben Chifley and Immigration Minister Calwell. As an indication of the high esteem in which Cole was held, the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Canberra invited Mr. Cole to take a seat on the floor of the House of Representatives. This was unprecedented, and I don't know of it having happened since. I had the pleasure of recording an 80-minute interview with John Cole at his home in Melbourne in 1984. He emigrated himself in 1958. I have digitised the original cassette recording, and it is available on YouTube. If you use the search words John J. Cole, Malta, Barry York, you should find it. 13 years later, in 1997, I again interviewed Mr. Cole, but this time for the Oral History Collection at the National Library of Australia. This interview was recorded over a few sessions and is 5 hours in duration and is a very important source of insights into how Malta developed its post-war emigration program and linked up with countries like Australia through assisted passage agreements. John Cole is an immensely important figure in 20th century Maltese political history. He was the first Minister for Emigration in the Labour government elected following self-government. He was from Casa Paula, born there in 1915. He became active in politics through the General Workers' Union of Malta, and prior to that he had been a school teacher. He died in the year 2000 in Melbourne. He is also noteworthy as the instigator of the MPEO, which stands for Malta's Prospective Emigrants Organisation. Shortly after the war, he placed adverts in the Maltese press calling for the formation of an organisation of people who wanted to emigrate, an organisation that could investigate the possible destinations and identify obstacles and solutions to the practical problems of emigration. Above all, the MPEO applied pressure on the colonial authorities who administered Malta prior to self-government. The MPEO was a remarkable mass movement. Huge meetings were held at which prospective emigrants could voice their opinions and where information was shared. It was like an unofficial People's Emigration Department, though of course it had none of the authority or power of an actual government department. This changed with self-government in 1947 when Labour was elected in Malta with Paul Boffa as the Prime Minister and Cole as Minister for Emigration. According to Mr. Cole, the colonial authorities had been very slow-moving, but this now changed with Malta's new legislative assembly able to forge its own way forward. The MPEO's basic platform provided the new government with a policy approach. In addition to John J. Cole and his Director of Emigration, John Axiza, I think credit for the Australia-Malta Assisted Passage Agreement on the Maltese side goes to Captain Henry Curmi, Malta's Commissioner in Australia, and Frank Corder, who was Curmi's legal advisor, an Australian, locally born. Looking at the Australian side, I think credit goes to the Labour Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, his Immigration Minister, Arthur Calwell, and the External Affairs Minister, Herbert V. Evatt. As early as 1945, Evatt had linked Australia's immigration policy to Malta's heroism during the war. He said Australia would welcome migrants from Malta of sound health and good character, as it is such people the Australian government wishes to encourage to come to Australia. Herbert V. Evatt's words were published in the Times of Malta in April 1945. The decision to welcome rather than restrict Maltese migrants was made by a subcommittee of the Australian Government's Interdepartmental Committee on Migration at its meeting on the 22nd of March 1944. Reading the minutes of the meeting, I was astonished by some of the ignorance expressed. The observer from the Australian Security Service, or ASIO as we know it today, Mr. Finzel, spoke in opposition to the request from Captain Curmi that the Maltese be placed on the same footing as other white British subjects. Finzel argued that the Maltese had been pro-Italian during the war. It's hard to fathom how he could believe that. This was in 1944, 2 years after Malta had been awarded the George Cross for civilian gallantry in the struggle against Nazism and fascism. However, wiser heads prevailed on this committee, and the representative of the Department of Labour wasted no time in pointing out that there had been no greater number of pro-Italians in Malta during the war than there had been pro-Germans in England. And I might just add, we know that some of the pro-Nazis in England were very highly placed people. William Keyes, representing the Department of Repatriation on the subcommittee, reminded everybody that the Maltese had, quote, purchased with blood their right to recognition as the equal of other British subjects, end quote. The subcommittee not only approved Kermy's request, but also raised the principle of assisted passages for Maltese migrants after the war. Why the Maltese should have had to pay the price with blood to be placed on equal footing with other British subjects is beyond me. But the past was becoming a foreign country, as the saying goes. The Malta-born population peaked in Australia in 1981, when the census counted 57,001. They were mostly in Melbourne and Sydney. Maltese interest in emigration has declined significantly since the 1970s, and at that time in the 1970s there was a return rate back to Malta. The need for assisted passages therefore also declined. According to the 2021 census, there were 35,413 Malta-born persons in Australia and approximately 200,000 persons of Maltese descent. John Cole described as heroes those among the first thousands who made the decision to migrate from Malta after the war. His logic was that they were alleviating the socio-economic problems of Malta and making life better for those who remained. To this I would add that in general those who migrated to Australia did not regret the move. They were quiet achievers in their adopted homeland. The Australia-Malta Assisted Passage Agreement laid the basis for a win-win situation, a win for Malta and a win for Australia. But this is not to suggest that it was easy for the migrants.